Welcome everyone. My name's Judy Savage. I'm Chair of the State Committee of the College of Physicians, but also Chair of the Committee of Chairs of Medical Colleges in Victoria. And the Committee of Chairs thought it would be good if we had some activities that combine different colleges. And one of the things that we thought might be useful was to have a session on opportunities in retirement. So these were really looking at things where we might use our medical skills, but we're not working full time doing clinical work. So we have 7 speakers and we'll have a break probably after the 4th one. There's one talk that we won't be having, which was on rural locums. And the reason for that was that all 3 people whom I asked to speak said that they were off doing locums and they wouldn't be coming back for the weekend. And they were in the Middle East, far north Queensland and in Alice Springs. And one of them had taken her dog with her too, in case you're wondering what the opportunities are when you're doing rural locums. And another one of our speakers who's not here at the moment is because he's swimming, I think, in Albert Park Lake in the seniors event at the moment, but he'll be back in time to give his talk. So I think it might become obvious, one of the reasons why I was interested in this talk was not because I was retiring, but I had someone or several people who had retired and who came and worked with me doing research when I was at Northern Health. And that was just wonderful for me as a support, but also they were very productive in what they did. But our first speaker is Lynda Campbell. And Lynda is a fellow of the College of Pathologists and several other colleges too. And she has been head of cancer cytogenetics at St Vincent's Hospital and is currently doing her PhD, leading on from some of the work that she did professionally. So Lynda.
Thank you, Judy, for inviting me to speak. I have to tell you that I am currently a second-year PhD student, so this is very much a work in progress. And I'm a part-time PhD student, so I'm quite early on in the process, but I am enjoying it enormously. I thought I'd start by just telling you a little bit about how I got to this position. This is where it started. I graduated in 1977, and this is the cohort from Royal Melbourne, and there are a couple of people in the audience who might find themselves in that picture. It was the 70s, you know. And then moving on to 1986, I was in my last year of my fellowship for the College of Pathologists in Haematology, and I was wondering what to do with myself. And I went to the International Society of Haematology meeting that was held in Sydney that year. One of the plenary speakers was a woman by the name of Janet Rowley, who identified what the Philadelphia chromosome actually was, that it was a translocation. She really was one of the doyens of cancer cytogenetics. And I was absolutely fascinated by this talk, to the extent that I went to see Margaret Garson at St Vincent's in Melbourne and asked how I trained in the specialty. She said, "You come and work with me." And so that's what I did. And by 1988, I had started, I had a fellowship from the Cancer Council, and I'd started working with Margaret. That went on. I had a sojourn in Philadelphia, but other than that, I remained at St Vincent's for the next few decades. I took over from Margaret when she retired in 1992, and we changed the name, because that's what you did in the 90s, you changed the name, to the Victorian Cancer Cytogenetics Service, and I proceeded to run that department for 25 years. I have to say I enjoyed it enormously. I found the work incredibly challenging, interesting, but there were a few things that made me start to think about retirement. One of them was battles over finance, and any of you who run departments will understand that. And one of my major problems was that I had an excellent clinical fellow who I was training to take over from me, and I was struggling to keep funding for her position. I also had some HR issues in the lab, which I was finding increasingly difficult to cope with. And there were also new technologies coming along, and I realized that I was going to have to put myself through a major reboot to learn about these new technologies. And I suddenly had the feeling, did I really want to do that? Anyway, all of that sort of welled up in me, and I pondered it for about 6 to 12 months, saw my financial advisor who said I could afford to retire, and I suddenly thought, aha, if I retire, then my successor can have my salary. I don't have to worry about it. She can deal with the HR issues. And she already knew about the new technologies. So this all seemed like a good plan. So this is my farewell, or one of them. It was a bit like Melba. And because it was a cytogenetics department, that's what the cake looked like. And so my retirement strategy was basically to sail away. One of the issues I thought was going to be a problem was that I was working full-time up until the day I stopped. And the thing I didn't want to do was to stop on Friday and then wake up on Monday morning and think, what on earth am I going to do now? And so my plan was to go to London for a year, because I thought that sounded like a nice thing to do. And I had a couple of friends who also thought that sounded like a nice thing to do. So we got an apartment in St. Martin's Lane, and we had a wonderful time. But as a sort of raison d'etre for going, and because I had always been interested in medical history, I decided to do a course at the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries in London. This is one of the, well, it is actually the oldest existing guild hall in London, because it's not the oldest guild, but they rebuilt it after the Great Fire in 1672. And this is where we had our lectures on medical history, which seemed highly appropriate. It was not a particularly grueling course. They had a day of lectures every 2 or 3 weeks. So there was actually plenty of time for mini breaks, we called them, going off to all parts of Europe and North America and walking in Italy and that sort of thing. It was a really lovely year, I would have to say. And by the time I came home, I'd virtually forgotten what working was like. You know, it was really quite a sea change. But one of the things that I developed in the course of this was a real interest in the history of medicine. And I decided that I would do the assessment for this course, which was completely optional. And in fact, more than half the people who did the course didn't bother to do the assessment. But, you know, I guess that Presbyterian work ethic was still there somewhere. And so I decided that that would be a good idea. The assessment consisted of essay-type exams, and I have to say these were the most archaic exams you've ever sat, but as fitting an institution that's been around for as long as the apothecaries. A 20-minute presentation and a 5,500-word dissertation on what they described as a piece of original historical research. Now, I had absolutely no idea what to do about that. I started by looking up, you know, the first descriptions of leukemias and that sort of thing. And that's a picture of the Wellcome Library, which I had access to by virtue of doing this course, and which is an absolutely wonderful place to work. It's really lovely. And then I found that, you know, all of this had been done. One of the lecturers that we had talked about taking oral histories. And basically it sounded like you just went along and chatted to people. And I thought, well, I can do that. You know, I do that all the time. I can do that. So I contacted a few colleagues, cytogenetics colleagues in London, whom I'd had dealings with during my working life, and asked them if they would be prepared to be interviewed about their lives and work and recorded. And they all graciously said, yes, sure, why not? And so I went along and did that. And I must say, these are people, a number of these people I knew quite well, but they had the most amazing stories that were completely unexpected. For example, one woman, Mary Martineau, who had worked as a cancer cytogeneticist really part-time while bringing up her family, had never had much of a career. But in fact, she started her career in 1961. She had done a zoology degree at Oxford, and she didn't know what to do with herself. And her family were White Russians. And her aunt from Paris wrote to her and said, why don't you come and spend some time in Paris with us? And there's this really fascinating paper that's been published recently about the fact that there's an extra chromosome in patients with Down syndrome. Why don't you go work with them? So she wrote to Jérôme Lejeune, who described trisomy 21 in Down syndrome, and went and worked with Jérôme Lejeune, who called her La Miss Anglaise. And she was there when he came into the lab one day and said, you know, I've just seen this extraordinary child who has a cry that sounds just like a cat. And they looked at the chromosomes, and that was the first description of cri du chat. You know, everyone I spoke to had these amazing stories. Anyway, so I had a lot of fun with that, and I put it together into 5,500 words, which was bloody difficult really, because there was so much just in 7 interviews fitting it into that small piece of writing that I had to leave a lot out. So anyway, another person I spoke to was Lorna Walker, who was one of the first people to describe the chromosome abnormalities in acute lymphoblastic leukemia in children, and showed that they had prognostic information. And she's now in her 80s, still going strong. And so I dutifully got my diploma and thought, well, you know, I'd really like to take this a little bit further. What can I do? One option was to just go around and independently approach cytogeneticists around the world and talk to them. I was a little bit nervous about that because although it was fine approaching people I knew, cold calling people without any sort of institutional backing, I thought would be a little bit tricky. I looked at enrolling in a master's program, which would give me an institutional backing and supervision. But you only write 20,000 words for a master's. I'd already struggled. I mean, I easily wrote 10,000 words with my initial foray. Plus you have to pay for a master's, which is ugly. And so then I thought, well, PhD, I can do that for free. And, you know, how hard can it be? Anyway, so I then thought, well, I need a supervisor. This was actually very difficult because I don't know if any of you have attempted to navigate the UniMelb website. I only looked at the University of Melbourne because I live in North Fitzroy. I didn't want to go anywhere too far away. The UniMelb website for students is a complete nightmare. I asked a few friends and got a couple of names of people that I approached, and you know, I wrote to them saying, I don't have an arts degree. I did a medical degree 40 years ago. You know, can I come and do a PhD with you? And they all sort of went, no. Finally, a good friend of mine, Chris Bayley, who worked at the Women's and who knew Janet McCalman, who I don't know whether you know her name, but she wrote the history of the Women's Hospital and is involved in medical history. Chris arranged for us to have coffee, and I told her what I wanted to do, which was to look at the early years of cancer cytogenetics. And there were a number of questions. Why were so many women in the field? You know, how had it evolved? What did having so many women do to the evolution of the field? She actually thought it sounded interesting, and she gave me the names of two people who I then wrote to saying that she had given me their names, and I went and saw them. They were both enthusiastic, and so that was fine. But that was a bit of a stumbling block. And so the next thing was to apply. Now, actually applying for this was the hardest thing I did, because the IT was a nightmare. And you know, I hadn't done an honours arts degree in the last 5 years, which was the obvious way to go into this. And so you then needed professional references and a track record. Now, my supervisor said my track record was such that there wouldn't be an issue for this. And I had two supervisors who were prepared to lie and say it was fabulous. And so that was fine. It was just that I couldn't get the bloody thing to work on the online application process. I not only rang Stop One, which is the UniMilb helpline, but I visited them personally. I finally gave up and emailed it all to them. It was a serious nightmare. Anyway, I finally got in. I went to a mixer for the new graduate students. I was very pleased to see that I wasn't the oldest person there. I was nearly the oldest person there, but I wasn't. But all of the 20-somethings were saying, oh, wasn't the application a nightmare, an absolute nightmare? So I felt a lot better about that. And so what challenges do new students face? Well, for those of us who went through medicine at Melbourne 40 years ago, the campus has changed a lot. And besides which, I'm now hanging out in places that I never ventured into. I'm in the arts faculty, the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies, the History and Philosophy of Science section. I am older than not only all my fellow students, or most of them, but than my supervisors. I have to say my fellow students are incredibly sweet to me and don't seem to mind the fact that grey hairs are hanging around in their personal space. One of the things I hadn't counted on is that to do an arts PhD at Melbourne these days, you have to do compulsory coursework. They only introduced this in the last 3 or 4 years. And I actually don't think it's a terrible idea, particularly for somebody like me who has no background in history. You have to do quite a lot of readings. You do have to write essays, though, as part of the assessment. Now, I hadn't written an essay in 40 years. And they also speak a completely different language. You know, I can speak medicine and I can speak science, but I can't speak humanities. And so for most of the readings, I have to sit there with a dictionary in front of me and look up every second word. I thought this was an issue that I had sort of managed to get my way around, but this year I've had to do 2 electives. The first one was in anthropology, and history jargon is absolutely small potatoes compared to anthropology. Anyone who uses epistemological or ontological every second word is a challenge. However, as I said, it is opening up new vistas, and I'm resurrecting some writing skills that clearly I'm going to need. So the advantages of being significantly older and doing this. Well, one of them is the last 40 years. I actually know what I want to study. which I didn't think was particularly earth-shattering, but until I discovered that other people aren't necessarily quite so focused. I know how to write a research plan. I know how to write an ethics proposal. I've been getting a lot of kudos for getting my ethics through by May of last year. But you know, I'm used to writing ethics proposals for genetics projects in a Catholic hospital. So this was absolutely not hard. And I guess one of the things I have unwittingly picked up over the last 40 years is that I know how to be pretty efficient with my time. And so what I'm doing is I am fitting this in around overseas travel, and I confess that the electives I have chosen because they fitted in within my travel plans. What I'm having to do is I'm studying part-time. I'm nearly finished my coursework, but I have already started the interview process because I figured why not. And so last year I went in December to the US and I did 26 interviews in 3 weeks in the US. It was fantastic. Some of the people I knew, a lot of them I didn't, but I enjoyed the process enormously. I put this photograph up here because Hope Panett is somebody that I knew from when I worked in Philadelphia. She's now in her 90s. And she worked for most of her working life at St. Christopher's Hospital in Philadelphia and was part of the team that described the DeGeorge syndrome. And in fact, this is the group of people who described it, with Angela DeGeorge being on the left, on the bottom. She had amazing stories to tell. She has been in genetics since the late 40s, initially as a corn geneticist, because nobody was looking at human genetics until the mid-50s, because nobody even knew how many chromosomes were in cells at that stage. So talking to people and how they came to this area of activity is endlessly fascinating. And so that is where I am up to date. That's my view from my part-time desk, which I share with somebody who's so intimidated by my grey hair that she never turns up. And that's the view from the 6th floor of Arts West. So thank you.
I'm a geriatrician there, so with an interest in dementia. So somehow in retirement, all these people, 2 of the 3 speakers have been interested in dementia. And Birch now is a recently established organisation called the Bayley Innovation and Research Collaboration for Health, which I'm the executive director. So I was asked by Judy, and I thank very much Judy for asking me to come and speak today about teaching and mentoring in retirement. And I'm not quite sure why she picked me. Only that I guess I've been a bit vocal within AMA about the challenges of this area, and so I was just trying to think in what way I would approach this, and I guess the question I wondered was why was everybody here, and why is mentorship and teaching going to be good, and I'll talk about that. And I think what the opportunities are, and then there are some things that need to be changed. And so I thought I couldn't lose the opportunity to actually make comment on why I think engaging in learning and teaching, particularly in retirement, is good. So a couple of my slides, actually, if I just go back, are actually from Professor Sheldon, who's provided some of these slides. So why do we need to be worried about this, or need to get retired doctors engaged? And certainly at a regional centre, my problem is that I haven't got enough people to do the teaching that I think we're going to need in the future. So if you look at these numbers, while there hasn't been a vast increase from 2010, From 2002 through till 2011, there's a near doubling. 2006, 2012, medical students commencing doubled. So remembering that the lead time into actual practice is 6 years to finish a course, even the postgraduate courses, because 90% of these people, well, they've done their biomedical science first mostly, but we've actually just made medicine a 7-year course, which is really crazy, but there we go. I'm from Deakin University, it's a postgraduate program, and so, but we've been left with that. But so these students are now very much coming into the registrar, senior registrar, and early consultant and early general practice space. And so there's some considerable need for support for those students, and behind them are those of us who were trained before then, and they're much smaller numbers. And remembering these are the numbers per year, so the actual numbers that are in the space is huge, and so there is a very great reason to have you. I guess with my geriatrician and dementia hat on, this is not new to those who are geriatricians or in this space in the room, but there is no doubt that what we're beginning to understand is the synapse plays an important role, and the first diagram here is the one that's often attributed to Jack, but also to Sperling. It documents the change in synaptic dysfunction, or the evolution of synaptic dysfunction, which is happening here. And as you'll see, this synaptic dysfunction is happening a long time before we actually see symptoms of dementia, and mild cognitive impairment is now, and prodromal AD are thoughts, now entities in the clinical space. And so the question is, can we do things to protect those synapses? And then that synaptic change and the early change is probably paralleled here. Both is work by Colin Masters, but looking at the evolution and the growth of amyloid, which actually amyloid is appearing in brains about 19 years prior to the onset of symptoms. So knowing that 25% of the population over the age of 75 or over the age of 85 will have dementia, I think we'll probably, unfortunately, accept the fact that within this room, there'll be 25% of us who are accumulating amyloid as we go. And so I just want to mention mild cognitive impairment, because this is the area that I'm interested in. It's this transition state between normal and dementia. We know that if you've got mild cognitive impairment, which is symptoms of memory change without significant impact on day-to-day life, is that the prevalence of dementia is double. And there are a number of things that are likely to be confounders to that, which we need to address. But there is this nice relationship between synaptic loss and cognitive decline. And the question is, why did we want to be involved in teaching and learning? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but is because there is some emerging evidence. I want to get to that. Oh, I've got that here. There we go. That would suggest, and this is from the guidelines, Development, Dissemination, Implementation Subcommittee of the American Academy of Neurologists, that would say that in patients with MCI, exercise training is likely to improve cognitive measures. But I was interested in the idea, considering this lecture, was that cognitive training may improve cognitive measures as well. So if you maintain your skill sets, if you challenge yourself in various ways, and I believe that teaching and mentorship is a very good way of doing that, then there's some emerging evidence that I think you'll be doing not only your community of professions a great service because of the need, but you'll also be doing yourself a service. So what do we need in teaching? And I guess my reflection of that is that while I think the universities are doing their best to teach, I think that most of us as who are clinicians on the ground are concerned, I think, about a couple of areas where I think that there's opportunities to get greater engagement and draw on the wealth of wisdom that is held within our senior clinicians in the profession. And believe it or not, I don't think you need to be a high-class specialist in a hospital to actually be able to teach physical examination and surface anatomy. I think once you're riding a bicycle, you can always ride a bicycle, and clinical examination is such a fundamental part of daily practice. And yet, surprisingly, I find it increasingly surprising in my world to be concerned that my medical students are not walking away being absolutely 100% comfortable to lay hands on skin. And I still find that a very challenging thing to get across. You know, once upon a time, I think every medical student used to carry a white coat and have stethoscopes and tendon hammers and pins in it. Now I think they're actually a bit embarrassed to even carry a stethoscope because that's carried by the physiotherapist, and they're trying to... Anyway, so there is that opportunity, and I point this out because I think that there's this sense that somehow, well, I mean, I've subspecialised into this area and therefore I don't have a great lot of skill set, or I've been out in my private practice, whether it's general practice or specialist practice, and I don't have a lot to offer. Well, that's just, I think, absolutely not true. I think that as practicing clinicians, you have a great deal to offer. And I think that's very useful. The other area that I think is a challenge for medical students, and I see it as a challenge for our junior doctors, is the management of clinical uncertainty. And I think this is particularly so in general practice, where in fact their life and practice is always working in the within the realm of uncertainty. I think in some specialist practice in hospitals, we can protect ourselves from certain degrees of uncertainty by extensive investigation. But most general practitioners would go home each day wondering whether or not they haven't missed something because of the breadth of information they have to hold on to. But as physicians, I think we also are in that space a lot as well. And I would speak as a regionally practicing physician, where in fact maybe we don't have as much access to extensive investigation. So again, you're always challenged around those areas of clinical uncertainty. And finally, I think in the area of health resource utilisation stewardship, this is going to be an area that we're going to have to become much more involved in. And I think having had a breadth of experience in practice where, as physicians, you'll be much better off at doing that. There are a couple of areas that I think we need to change. And I think this is enormously challenging. I've raised this at Federal AMA National Conference. I've raised it within the AMA in Victoria. APRA has made life extraordinarily difficult for practitioners, particularly doctors who aren't necessarily doing a lot of active practice. At the moment, you can either have a general registration or a restricted registration, or you can have a non-practicing registration. Non-practicing registration will not allow you to set foot inside a hospital. You would not be able to go to a patient's bedside with a group of students and teach, because they define practicing and APRA as teaching and research, non-clinical, you name it, anything that you might think you might do, and all the stuff that Sandra very eloquently discussed, you probably couldn't do and call yourself a practitioner at the same time.
Sorry to interrupt
yep.
you, but you can't even publish in the Australian Doctor if you're a non-practicing.
Thank you. So, which I think is utterly crazy. So, but I don't think I'm going to get to change that. So there is limited registration, which is actually written up really for overseas trained graduates, but because the government so wanted or so desperately needed people to teach AMC exams, they decided they'd have limited registration, so they get people to teach international grads, and they usually for international grads for teaching and research. The problem with that is that you actually have to do that 4 weeks in every year. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a hell of a lot in teaching. Particularly, for instance, in the way we run our program, where we have a rotation where we do surgery, for instance, in the first half of the year. And if you're teaching in one of those practices, if you're teaching in that, you might teach 2 or 3 tutorials a week. Well, you're not going to get your 4 weeks, even in a 6-month program of active, and you have to have full-on practice. And so if there's something that I would implore you to do is to start agitating to get this change, because I don't think I can draw you in to my practice without that. And I want you to be at the bedside. And so in order for the hospital to accredit you to come into the hospital, you have to be registered in some way, and non-practicing registration wouldn't allow you to do that. That's the first thing. The second thing I find absolutely, utterly ridiculous is the requirement for practitioners over the age of 70 to be screened cognitively. This is now a requirement. And in fact, as my supervisor for my PhD, Henry Bradati, said, I think it's a bit strange that I have to go to a GP to have an MMSE done, considering he leads most of the dementia as a psychiatrist in a dementia space, and have my MMSE done by my GP. It is utterly crazy. It's not only crazy because I think it's ageist. I think it's also completely unevidence-based. And in fact, screening tools that we have where there are no symptom markers to improve the positive predictive value of the population you're screening is a complete waste of time. In fact, on the MMSE and MMSE alone, perhaps a little better with the clock drawing test, but on the MMSE alone, you'd find many, many more false positives if you do an MMSE on a normal and well non-symptomatic population over the age of 70 than you will find any positives, true positives. And that's just the evidence. And yet we haven't yet got APRA to cut this out. I think it's a completely different kettle of fish that if someone who is of 70 has a report because there's an error made, that may be our first inkling that there's a problem, and that's not an unreasonable thing to consider cognitive assessment at that time. But the concept that just because you're 70, you should have your cognitive screening is utterly crazy. So I think that's probably really all I had to say in this space. I guess all I heard was this quote from Einstein, and I thought it was beautiful. So education is what remains after one has forgotten what one learned in school. I think that education really is our wisdom, and as clinicians, particularly as physicians, that wisdom is still preserved and has a great resource for our students and our junior doctors in practice. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Any questions for Mark? Mark, do you employ some people who aren't in full-time clinical practice now? As teachers?
As teachers. We've tried, and one of the reasons I got on this bandwagon, I guess, is because two of my colleagues in Ballarat, both of whom are brilliant teachers with huge experience that wanted to continue teaching, but came up against APRA and didn't want to have to be committing to 4 weeks of doing something, and I didn't have enough for 4 weeks. And they just wanted to come in and do short cases with my students, perhaps once every couple of weeks during their medicine rotation. I couldn't recruit them, and in a town like Ballarat, where we're short already, it's a disaster.
Anybody have any solutions?
I don't have the solution, but it's a very accurate summary of the problem. I do some locums here and there in the country. And what really troubles me, the students are afraid to take a history, and they don't understand that as doctors, we're really bright guys with a tremendous intellectual capacity to acquire information and then integrate it and then do something useful with it. But they don't then even integrate the information from taking the history and then examine it. And you're right, they're afraid to get close to the bedside. They don't strip the patient down. They don't undress them. They don't examine the apex beat. They don't undress the ladies and feel for the breast lumps. What has gone wrong where we're so afraid to examine a person properly? That we as a profession must really, really stand up for the patients in the profession. And I think what's going on with the legislative rules, control, is disgusting and bad for medicine. And we're actually going to degrade medicine and patient care if we don't stand up for our patients and ourselves.
Look, as a dean of a medical school, I'm very disappointed, obviously, to hear that commentary, but I think it's a very, very difficult skill, and it's not that we don't want to teach it. In fact, I think the community, I don't know that we have institution-wide, large institutions have blotted their copybook across many major areas. Medicine, fortunately, has been relatively protected, although I think that we're always at risk. The reality is that privacy, fear about accusations and concern about transgression and borders the way the college, not the college, the way the board, the medical board talks about this has, I believe, led medical students to be absolutely terrified and actually not terribly clear about what they could and couldn't do. And I was very surprised, and I remain surprised about how much reservation students have. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted my more senior clinicians in the space, because you demonstrate enormous confidence in that interaction. And I think that needs to be behaviourally modelled for students. And I fear that we will soon lose that beautiful art that's part of the wisdom that is within our retired and senior clinicians.
Once one retires, getting CPD points becomes virtually impossible. I'd just like to know, in relation particularly to the previous speaker, Professor Zerke, is one still considered a doctor if, for positions on boards, focus groups, all those sorts of things? Because once you've lost your CPD points and not recognised by your college, you can't be registered as a practitioner. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I looked this up. So, in fact, if you're on a hospital board, nothing but a board, non-executive board director, that actually counts for APRA as medical service. So if you read the APRA guidelines for registration, they'll go through all the things you can do. And medical teaching is also medical service. So there's lots of medical services not seeing a patient that does count. Oh, so with the CPD points, attending conferences, and if you're involved in an advisory for a university or for an organisation, they'll have talks. Often on an advisory, you'll be going to their talks or giving their talks, and then you write that down. And as I said, the publications, so those publications I showed you that no one's doing, the case reports, and every publication counts for a lot of CPD. I know, because I do my CPD and I max it out by January because I publish, and each publication's worth a huge number of CPD points. So if you do a publication, and the thing is now, because I split it in 5 categories, actually you just kind of do one thing in every category and you'll get the points very quickly. But you might have to attend a clinical grand round at Royal Melbourne Hospital or at the university to bring up those points.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, so if you want to do this without CPD points and you still want to be a kind of doctor on a commercial board or whatever, but you're not registered, is that still possible? Or
no, you've got to be registered, right. But I'm saying you can actually maintain your CPD, even if you're not seeing 100 patients a week like you used to, you can still actually meet the CPD criteria. As an academic, I took 2 years out where I was only doing a half day a week in clinic. And my husband, who's a geriatrician, was extremely annoyed because I was seeing like 5 patients a week. He was seeing hundreds. He struggles with his CPD and I get mine by February. The CPD system's actually around all the stuff you'll be doing more than it is around patient care in a funny way.
There is a new problem though with the College of Physicians CPD with the quality assurance points. The revised thing for this year, I agree with you until this year, but the revising, I chair a QRSM, I chair an MMAE, and I'm not sure that I'm going to get my quality assurance points.
Okay, I can say that the College of Physicians has 4 meetings a year on a Saturday morning. This is not one of them, but they're 3 hours each. They're workshops, and you do get 6 points for attending each of them, and there is no cost associated with them. John Scarlett,
yeah, the problem is that with the change that the college has instituted, we used to get points for education, which those morning meetings are great for, and also for teaching. But now we can only get 50% of our points by combined education and teaching, and the other 50% have to come, or 40% I think it might be, have to come and involve elements of audit and feedback. And unless you're in an institution that has regular audit meetings that you participate in, you're stuffed on those.
Yeah. Okay, good.
So the scientific advisory counts for the audit. If you're on an advisory board, that counts as an audit.
I think that there will be a number of people in this situation, and maybe there are opportunities to work out ways of dealing with it, or for altering it too. I'd like to just move on to our next speaker before morning tea, and it's Des Parkin, who was previously Director of Pathology at Boston Health, and who's going to talk on research. Thanks, Mark. Good.
push the right and left button. That's it. We go on to... Thanks. Thanks very much, Judy. I'm going to share a brief experience of research in retirement, volunteering in a small research team, and the experience is neither novel nor is it unique. And I'm sure there are a number of individuals in the audience who could give this talk much better than me. But anyway, I'll talk about my experience anyway. It's presented for one reason really, and that is that people, when they're thinking of volunteering, may not think of research. It may be something that doesn't come readily to mind. Research and retirement, a model, right? I'm going to do a little bit of reading from the slide. I always advise people, I know some people don't like it very much, but I always advise people, if they had a slide on, talk to the slide. If they weren't going to talk to the slide, turn the slide off. Well, I've got the slide on, so I'm going to talk to it. A bit of reading. Many career academics continue their research after retirement. It's part of their life. And that's not what I'm really talking about. My intention is to present a simple model which can provide a stimulating research interest for doctors who've had minimal or no research experience during their professional career. I've noted here, if volunteering is on your radar, there are a lot of opportunities, and this includes research where even without special skills, a committed pair of hands is invaluable. I would think that few research teams would reject an intelligent and enthusiastic gopher. Now, the model, someone has to take an initiative, and it's generally taken by the team leader, which was in my case, or the retiree, and a volunteer becomes a team member. At the same time, they may well become a staff member of the mother institution. I think there are a lot of reasons why this would be a desirable thing. Apart from the salary, the volunteer then may function in the team in much the same way as the other team members. It must be remembered that many co-workers in a research group may not be tenured, but dependent on the uncertainty of recurrent research grants for continuing employment. That's the model. My experience, I retired from hospital practice age 61 in 2001, so I'm pretty old. I'm 80 this year. I have to say it was one of my very best clinical decisions. From 2003 to 2013, I was a volunteer, a senior fellow at Melbourne University in the Department of Medicine at Northern Health. A little bit about the laboratory, and I just want to tell you about some of the human parts of the activity. The team leader was Judy Savage, who's chairing this meeting. And the research interest of the team was collagen and mutations in collagen, particularly type 4 collagen, which mutated leads to a form of sex-linked renal failure called Alport syndrome, which is also accompanied by deafness. As time progressed, attention moved to mutations in type 3 collagen, which cause a disorder of distensible tissues called Ehlers-Danlos disease type 4. This is rather less common than Alport syndrome, and it's a dramatic disorder where adults suffer rupture of the heart, great vessels, bowel and uterus. And the general hypothesis was that mutations would be more clinically damaging if they occurred at sites of biological activity rather than in silent areas of the molecule. This is a team, I don't know if it's a pointer, but some PhD students, social worker, laboratory manager, chief scientist, another postgraduate student, Judy, statistician, and Hamish Ewing, the Professor of Surgery. That's just a few faces. That's the research team, more or less. What were my duties? They were pretty simple. First of all, to attend a weekly team meeting and a research seminar. Secondly, to do literature searches. And thirdly, to construct computer models of collagen. You might not know, but computer molecular modelling using professional software is extremely expensive and can cost $100,000 plus. So we had to achieve something fairly cheap, which we did using layered Microsoft Word with font size 5. Font size 5 is very small. Most of you would have to use a magnifying glass to read it. Just a little bit about collagen. You know of DNA as a double helix of bases, sugar and phosphate. Well, collagen's a triple helix. And you can see the 3 peptides here, and it's made up of repeating sequences of glycine and 2 other amino acids, which are often proline and hydroxyproline. There are 28 forms of collagen, some of them quite obscure, and the 2 that we were interested in here are shown here. Type 4 collagen actually forms a reticular pattern like a wire fence, and it's fundamental to the basement membrane, which is the reason why the glomerulus fails when there are mutations in type 4 collagen. Type 3 collagen is much more like type 1 collagen, where mutations cause fragile bone disease. Type 3 collagen's quite important in early embryogenesis, and it's also a fundamental molecule in wound repair. Now this shows an example of a map with type 3 collagen, and you can see here strips of 3, which are the 3 peptides in the triple helix, and you can see some notations which are biological activities, and I'll show you a more high-powered picture, but the mutations are all recorded here above the triple helix. And it's rather interesting. This is an A4 sheet, and there are in excess of 4,000 alphanumeric entries on this A4 sheet. So it's a pretty crowded document. This shows it magnified at 400 times. We had to work at 400 times in order to read it. And it was very easy to get lost because at that magnification, it's a huge document. Sometimes it was like the GPS going wrong. You'd be inside the molecule, but you wouldn't know which way to go to get out of it. But anyway, that's more or less what it looked like. Now, was the research productive? Well, in research, as you know, publications are a critical marker of success, and I've just recorded here the 2 major publications that came out of the study, one in 2011, which is a major article in Human Mutation, where it was, we published the model of type 4 collagen and its mutations and all the sites of biological activity. And the second paper, which came out a couple of years ago in the Public Library of Science journal, PLOS ONE, and that contained the model of collagen type 3, which proved in many ways to be very like type 1 collagen. I won't say much about the papers except to say that there was mutations weren't randomly spread in the molecule. There were areas where quite dense with mutations and other areas which were fairly silent, and it was thought that that might be because mutations at that point were embryonic lethal. The hypothesis was sustained to a certain degree. There was some relationship between mutations occurring at biological active sites and the severity of the disease, but it wasn't all that clear-cut. just to put a human face on the collaborators, I've identified the overseas collaborators from the last paper, and just for interest, there was James San Antonio, who was a Collagen chemist and a researcher at Stryker Biotech. Anton Persikov, who was at Princeton, he was a postgraduate student at Princeton. He was a Moscow PhD, who was actually a Russian citizen. Raymond Dalgleish, who was Professor of Genetics at the University of Leicester and was the curator of the mutation database for collagen type 3. Shane Jensen, who did all the stats, who was a Professor of Statistics at the University of Pennsylvania, and Xavier Jeanmet, who was a Professor of Genetics at the University of Paris at the Hospital of Pompidou. Anyway, just to put some faces on the collaborators, some of whom became close friends. Certainly at one stage, we had Skype. We Skyped at 9 o'clock in the morning, James San Antonio, and he'd be in his car driving home from work at late afternoon. What were the benefits of the exercise? Well, being part of a youthful, enthusiastic team, I think is good for older people like many of us. There was mental stimulation. There was a new challenge, something I'd never done before, and I found it quite exciting. There was a feeling that you were doing something worthwhile, a contact with an international team, and one or two of these collaborators became very close friends. I certainly exchanged Christmas cards and birthday cards with one of them still. And it was a situation where you could do as much as you like. You could fill the day if you wanted to, or you could do a medley of other things like playing golf, which I do a little bit, or try. Now, I've finished by listing some issues for volunteers or potential volunteers to consider, and I think there are also issues for people who might be thinking about having a volunteer. First of all, and I didn't do this, but I think it's a good idea, it's advisable to have an agreement which states the nature and expectations of the job. Also, some review process which determines satisfaction from both points of view. Also, it's critical to have some dedicated office space. One of the things that puts people's nose out of joint in small offices is a newbie who arrives and takes over something that's been someone else's office space. So agreement about these things and about computer access and the tools of trade, I think getting that all right at the start is very important. There should be insurance cover in the event of unforeseen events such as personal injury and liability. You might have to check with your medical insurer. Laboratory analyses may have an unanticipated clinical consequence, and you must be aware of that. There's a cost to volunteering which may be significant. Costs are not tax deductible, as the taxation department reminded me in a letter the year after I retired. They're very nice about it. It's also important to have parking access. If at all possible, this should be free. I found this was a very important item as I was able to park next door to the laboratory. Some activities were in Dick Cotton's department at St Vincent's, which was accessed on the tram, so that was quite good. But I think the mode of access is critical. If work hours are flexible, it's very helpful if you can travel to and from work and avoid peak hours. And in fact, I used to go to work at about 9:30, and then I'd go home sometime in the afternoon, and that worked very well. It was my experience that in some institutions, employee databases all flow down from the payroll. Although I was an employee of Melbourne University, I was constantly anonymous because all the databases in the university came from the payroll. If you weren't receiving pay, they didn't know who you were. And of course, you're using services like the library. So it's important to get that right. Quite surprising too. Most large institutions will have an employment category for volunteers. And I think it's important to check that you are comfortable with the limitations of this category for your situation, because the kind of person who might be envisaged by the organisation as a volunteer might not, for example, be a medical person working in a research laboratory. Contrary to what people have said, and this is a couple of years ago, I found that the medical board had a category of registration which neatly fitted a medical research volunteer. There were no problems whatsoever. But, and the last point I want to make is that in the event that there are workplace annoyances, and these are inevitable in a busy workplace, remember you are there to help, not hinder. A salaried employee may be there because they have to be. You are there because you want to be. So if you feel irritated about something, just think, well, I'm here to make things better, not worse, and don't get your knickers in a knot about it. I just want to finish by thanking Judy for the experience and also thanking Professor Michael Jelinek for some advice and encouragement.
Any questions for Des? Can I say Des used to come out one day a week and he might leave, you know, when he was ready to leave at lunchtime, but he was able to do a lot of that work on the computer at home, consulting, and he'd come in the next Tuesday waving things around saying, I found another molecule that binds to type 4 collagen. So it was a matter of spending many hours searching through the published literature and finding things, and I think he wrote a chapter and he got 3 publications in that time. And it was a wonderful support. I think it was having somebody around also whom I knew, and you can see as we were in the rear car park. That's why Des could park next to the lab. Any other questions? Okay, morning tea. Thank you.
Yes, that's good. Well, just so possible. Oh, yeah. Yes, still going the right way. Yeah, I'm still working. Yes, yeah, I'm still working. Yes.
Trying to win the grand final. I've tried 20 times. I've been successful. Nice to see you anyway. See you, Daddy. I can get
They need it for their life, but they don't need it to us. Well, it starts on Monday. It sounds like if I'm not doing something, I don't want people to think that's right. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Peter Bridges. Briggs, of course. Well, sort of. I'm still going to be another young bloke. Trying to get me to come in. I'm not sure. I would like to Quite well, yeah, I haven't been there, which is where we usually agitate from within. Still there, I take it. But that's all coming down because it's still there. For you particularly, because you ended up at Pratt for many years. stand inside there, I think. On the left.
Got it. You might be next, though. Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker is Bruce Waxman. I'll just repeat that, Bruce Waxman. And I have met Bruce on a number of government committees and boards. Well, they're not boards, but committees. And I know that he was a surgeon and works as now in administration in a rural health centre. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Judith, and thank you for giving me the opportunity of speaking this morning. As Judy mentioned, my background as a surgeon, but I greatly respect the physicians who I work with over the years, and I can see a number in the audience who I've worked with, and a number of presidents who I've worked with. So my talk is going to be very much around physicians, and I hope the talk's on. No. Could you get my talk up? Or as I choose it on there? Okay. Here, hold on. I'll do that. Where do we go to?
Here.
Okay.
Do you want me to do it?
Yeah, you do it. We often use physicians to help us out when we've got difficult patients
Is
to
this
deal
it?
with.
No.
No, that's mine.
Yeah. Okay.
And
If we could, no. Sorry, if we could have some IT just to find the talk. Where is it?
yeah, I'm
Waxman,
very
where's
interested
Waxman
in
opportunities
perioperative
here?
medicine, and that's where physicians and surgeons work together in
Okay.
managing perioperative patients. And yeah, I can see someone in the audience who's been a perioperative physician most of his life.
Sorry, it might be here. Which is yours? Waxman opportunities.
That's it.
Yep, good.
And then down the bottom. Yep.
Okay, sorry.
Good, okay. So being a surgeon, I'm taking a bit of liability, a bit of a slightly different approach to the topic I was given, which is about opportunities in medical administration. But I'm also going to be talking about an area that interested me, particularly with surgeons, and that is the aging physician. The importance of humility, insight, and cultural change as you move from your current role into a transition role as you get older. My current position is as Chief Medical Officer at Bass Coast Health, is in Wonthaggi, that's in south coast of Gippsland. I'm also an honorary consultant at Monash Health. But the other thing that I'm involved with, and that'd be relevant to my talk, is I'm secretary of the A3G, which is the Adapting to Aging Advisory Group. So I'll be talking a bit about that as well. But my main topic is, what are the opportunities in medical administration? You've worked as a physician all your life, you want to retire, maybe you're not quite ready to completely leave medicine, but you'd like to do something a bit different. And I think medical administration is something to seriously consider. You guys think of us as being on the dark side, but in fact, we're on the light side because we're here to help the doctors. That's what the main role of medical administrator is. So a lot of people ask me, how have you made the change? And I said, well, being a surgeon, it was very easy. Managing patients, they do what they're told. Managing doctors, they don't. And although that's a bit of a challenge, I find very useful because my motto is, can I make a difference? If I can make a difference to the well-being of my doctors, that'll mean I'm making a difference to the well-being of my patients. So that's my approach. So there are a lot of opportunities, either if different sort of names are given, Chief Medical Officer, Director of Medical Services, or Director of Clinical Governance. And there are different positions that you can hold within that role, either in a metropolitan health service, either in the public or the private system, in a regional, sub-regional rural centre as a Director of Medical Service, in the health department in different roles, and the private health funds now have medical administrators working with them, as do some of the medical indemnity insurance companies. So there's plenty of opportunities out there. How do you get there? It's probably best if you're going to work in another specialty to get the appropriate qualification. A lot of DMSs don't, and doing the FRACPA, the Fellowship of the Royal Australian College of Medical Administrators, is a challenge because there is an exit exam, and you need to have done a master's as well. So it's not just doing the fellowship, but you do a master's. In my case, I'm doing the Masters of Health Service Management at Monash, but you can get recognition of prior learning if you've done a previous master's degree. Probably the easiest way for a physician is go through the executive pathway based on your recognition of prior learning, and it's 12 months, but you need to have done a master's degree of some description that would be recognised. The other alternative is do the FRACPA, the associate of the college. That's a 12-month course with 3 modules, and it doesn't have an exit exam. And that's very popular now for DMSs working in country areas because it's funded by the Department of Health. The other options are to just use your skills, knowledge, and experience as a physician, and you can get a job just by virtue of that. The other suggestion I would make to anyone who's maybe pursuing a career after being a physician and is looking on possibly going onto boards, particularly health service boards, is to do the Australian Institute of Company Directors course. It's fairly expensive, but it's over a week intensive course, but there is an exit exam. You need to do an assignment and pass a multiple choice question, a series of multiple choice questions, but at the end of that, you get these nominals after your name as graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. So that's something to consider. What physicians have followed this pathway? And I must apologise in advance that Peter McDougall's name is not there. I'm sorry, Peter. I met him as I came in the room. Peter was the Chief Medical Officer at the Children's Hospital. But these are some of your physician colleagues who you may know who have followed that pathway. Some who've done the FRACPA, others who have doing it by virtue of their skills, knowledge, experience. There are 2 separate models. One is to make a clean cut from your role as a physician and just do medical administration work. That's what I decided to do. The other is to continue doing some part-time consulting and also be a medical administrator. My feeling was it's difficult to manage doctors when you're a doctor yourself doing the same job, but a lot of people do it that way. So that's all about medical administration. Get on to the other part of my talk, which is about the ageing physician. And I've modified this from a talk to giving to surgeons, but it's fairly similar. We're all doctors, we all get old. So it's how manage your current performance, how you transition from a surgeon to what, and some aspects about adapting to ageing. Humility and performance. What are some of the problems of an ageing physician? And they are that you are past your peak, you don't see as many referrals, you probably have potentially more adverse events and may be reported to either APRA or to a medical indemnity insurance company. You have to cope with deteriorating health, you're losing some insight, cognitive decline, and probably most important, you're reluctant to relinquish that role as a doctor. Very important issue. So how does an ageing physician cope with this and how they demonstrate humility and do it well? The first thing is a phase withdrawal. If you're going to retire, you need to reduce your volume and your complexity possibly before you make that exit. You come off the on-call roster or ward service and you look for alternatives. And a number of speakers today have given you options for different alternatives, either in administration, teaching, research, coaching, or continue doing medico-legal work. I decided that I would not do that, and you'll come to that a bit later. I decided to make a clean break. I felt if I'm not in active practice, I cannot be an expert witness, particularly for a plaintiff, against another surgeon. So I decided not to follow that route, but that's maybe controversial. I've written a paper about caring and sharing to avoid burnout, and these are the elements about that. You need to look after yourself, you need to look after your colleagues, share the workload, share the tasks. Group practice is undoubtedly the way to go. I've done that myself. But at the end of your career in group practice, you need to work out some succession planning. Who's going to take over when you leave the practice? And that comes with empowering your younger colleagues. What about this issue of cognitive function? Mark's talked about this previously today, and I had a quick chat to him, and he said, free rein, Bruce, say what you like. But there's good evidence that impaired doctors have a cognitive impairment as well. This is the study done in New South Wales. What's the problem with your brain as you get older? And these are some of the elements of neurocognitive change with age. Fluid intelligence is the one that goes earliest. Processing speed, episodic memory, hearing, visual acuity, depth perception, colour discrimination, and manual dexterity, all issues that are changed with age. So what have the College of Surgeons in America done about this? They've done a lot of work on cognitive function in surgeons. Now, you may say this isn't relevant to physicians, but I think it is. So they've recommended that for surgeons, and I think this would also apply to physicians over the age of 65 to 70, that you have a regular physical examination and you get yourself a GP if you haven't one already. And the other controversial issue is this voluntarily assess yourself for neurocognitive function. We might come to that a bit later. And be humble and insightful and voluntarily disclose if you're concerned about the limitations and activities. So in summary, to show humility, you need to take on the challenge of aging and accept the potential need for performance and cognitive assessment. What about this transition? How are you going to go from physician to what? And these are the 7 questions I'll explore. Why will I retire? Because I want to. Before I'm pushed, before I get the tap on the shoulder, and before Evan sent me the letter about the patient who's going to sue me. When should I go? When you're ahead, rather than when you find that things are going wrong and you need to bail out. Before I'm asked to, and before that medico-legal disaster that may hit you. Where will I live? Will I stay in my big house in Malvern, or will I move to my unit in Inverloch? That's a question you need to decide. It's probably a good idea to move before you retire, but downsizing isn't always cheap. Who will I be? Clearly, I need to look after myself and my health and have a GP. I need to stay healthy and robust and always have something to look forward to, and be prepared to go back and explore another pathway, another option, another opportunity. How will I do it? Will I make a clean break? Well, I do the blurred sort of Melba, stop and start, or will I bridge, find a job, a career until I finally retire? I did a combination of both. I made a clean break for being a surgeon, and I bridged to being a medical administrator. And these are some of the options after withdrawal. With whom will I live? I need to stay close to my family. It's very important to have family connections and social connections, and that's one of the elements of good aging. Will I plan? Maybe a bit late for some people in this room, but at age 55, you need to develop a 10-year plan. And that involves clearly having enough money, a good superannuation fund, and also to help you plan, I'd recommend consider getting a lifestyle coach, which I did, and that helped me quite a bit. So the 9 R's relating to retirement. First of all, retire the word retirement. Call it something else. It's a transition in your life. Transition from one phase to the next, into the golden years of your life, often that's called. Retain the competencies, because you need to have some CPD. We've talked about that earlier today. Restructure your priorities, renew your zest for education, and we've had discussions from Mark about that, and respond to new opportunities, and I've given you some in medical administration. Recharge your system by taking up physical activities. Keep fit. People play golf, but I suggest to do other things as well. The one I really like is revisit your childhood dreams. Things you've always wanted to do, but you've been too busy because you've been on ward service all the time. And so that's something to consider, like learning to play the piano again. You need to be responsible, of course, for winding down your practice. And remember, your wisdom is still with you. So finishing off this one about insight and transition, this is a quote from a surgeon, but it relates as well to physicians. You need to have 3 things in your retirement. Enough money, I've talked about, developing outside interests, but most importantly, is that knowing in one's heart that one's self-worth is not dependent on being a physician. Finally, about cultural change. How can we adapt to this issue about ageing? And I'll go through these 6 things. So I'm in this group called Adapting Your Ageing Advisory Group. That's the people, a nice range of people on that. And we were actually asked by APRA to give a submission about what they should do about cognitive assessment over the age of 70. We put in our submission and withdrew it because we weren't happy the way the APRA were going about the process, but that's another story. So what do we do in this group? We do research aiming at, with doctors, healthy aging, adapting to aging, and making the transition to retirement, and this controversial issue about cognitive testing. The 5 domains of change in aging are listed there. Most of them are aware of those: sensory, physical, emotional, systemic, and cognitive. So what are the changes in cognitive function in aging? The College of Surgeons in the United States found this heterogeneity. That is, cognitive aging doesn't always match with the age itself. So there are some what are called super agers who over the age of 75 function as well as those less than 35. So it's a bit variable. The main function you're going to lose is your fluid intelligence, the capability to think adaptively and analytically. Your crystalline intelligence will remain with you. That is what you've learned over the years. And you see a patient and you recognize immediately what the problem is. The age-related decline that occurs with surgeons and physicians is attention, reaction time, visual learning, and memory. So there are some of the issues about cognitive aging. So how can you avoid that? How can you adapt? What things can you do to improve your mental and physical function? Well, the first is just every day do some sort of mental exercise. Either it's a brain teaser or crosswords. Cryptic crosswords are probably the best thing to learn. If you can't do them now, it's probably a good idea to start learning. Learn something new. Go to the University of the Third Age. Go and with Philip, who's doing that course, and do something different. Keep your brain active. Do some memory training with computer games. Regular physical exercise really helps a lot in brain function, and maintain your social networks. I mentioned that before, the importance of social contacts and friends and family. Yeah, cognitive testing is a bit controversial, whether you should self-assess or not, what sort of test you should use, and we can maybe discuss that a little bit later in question time. So in summary about the aging physician and how to deal with humility, insight, and cultural change, self-care is probably the most important thing. Look after yourself over those 5 domains. Consider having some form of self-assessment of cognitive function, and respond to any advice or change that may be relevant to that. Be insightful and humble and take on new opportunities. And finally, accept cultural change and adapt. Now, my last slide is about me. What did I do? How did I deal with this? And people down the back, I'm sorry that everything should be on the top half of the slide, but it's often hard to read down the back. So what I did, I was a surgeon most of my life. At the age 63, I had a ischemic stroke and was very fortunate. I got thrombolyzed and I've made a pretty good recovery, do you think? And I've also got type 2 diabetes. So not only did I make the decision to clean break, but I had troubles with disability insurance. The second thing is I had a succession plan. In my group practice, I had a group of surgeons who I'd trained, and we were all on the same page. And so it was easy for me to transfer my practice to one of my junior colleagues. That's empowering junior colleagues. I then sold my practice to my group. And this issue of goodwill doesn't exist anymore, right? The goodwill happened to be all the computers and stuff, the files, and we sort of agreed on a figure about that. My retirement plan was to work on my flower farm, which I inherited. I put that in inverted commas. You don't often inherit things if you've got 3 siblings, because they didn't want to go into a flower farm with me, so I bought them out. So I was going to retire on the flower farm, and I organised an executive coach to help me in establishing my own consulting company. But then I got headhunted to be a DMS at Epworth. And so that changed my whole approach, and I adapted to that role and started my FRACMA. Things didn't work out quite well with Epworth in that I didn't get on that well with the CEO, and I probably made some errors. So I moved into a role as a DMS in a small country hospital, continued my FRACMA and continued my masters. And to keep fit, I row. And I've just rowed this morning in a regatta. So it's important to keep fit, keep your brain active, and adapt well to aging. Thank you.
Thanks. Any questions about that? And I mean, I know that there is a shortage of DMSs throughout rural Victoria at the moment, and this was kind of one of the opportunities for rural locums, but also for people who might go into medical administration.
Yes.
You know, especially at a part-time basis.
Yeah, Judith is quite correct. There are shortages of DMS in country areas, and one that's just recently taken, I mentioned his name is David McConaughey, who is a DMS in Bairnsdale. He's taken up that role. He still does a little bit of cardiology. So yeah, and I think if you're wanting to do that, probably the FRACMA is the way to do that. It's a 12-month course. It's about all the basic principles that you learn in the FRACMA, but it's much easier to do. And will put you in good stead if you want to take a DMS role. And, you know, if you've got somewhere, a holiday house somewhere that you might want to retire to in that area of Victoria, then go for it. Yep.
Yes.
No. It's open to anyone. Most of the people doing masters aren't doctors. Most of them are nurses and allied health people. But you don't have to be involved in a specific medical role. No. Yep. Your own recognition of prior learning from your degree and your fellowship would be enough to get you able to apply for that role. Yep. Yep. Yes, Ian?
Bruce, the American College of Surgeons Working Party on the older surgeons did recommend that there be compulsory neurocognitive testing at a certain age.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How close do you think surgeons in America are taking that?
I think they're closer every year, and I can't give you an exact estimate of when, but as I've mentioned, they've done a lot of research in this area and are very proactive in encouraging their surgeons to at least self-assess at the moment. But I feel personally that it's going to happen, that sooner or later we as older physicians are going to have some mandatory assessment of our cognitive function.
Can I just say to the person who asked the question about the master's degree that things are a little bit different from when I was at university and everyone had to enrol by a certain date in the beginning of the year. With master's programs now, there's often 6 intakes a year, and you can do different master's degrees, for example, of health service management, online with assessments. Usually the assessments are due every 2 weeks with a short 6-week block. So it's not quite, and you don't have to go somewhere and sit for an exam like the exhibition building.
Yeah, just a quick comment.
So there's just lots and lots of different opportunities now.
And the comment about the masters is that it's online, but you actually interact quite a lot online with your colleagues in your group who are doing it. And for your weekly assignments, you see each other's assignments and you comment on them. So you're learning actually from other people in your group. And some of the units actually don't have an exam. It's all based on your assignments. So it's something to consider. Yep.
I'm interested in when that point's reached, because often when you go into medical administration, the number of clinical hours that you do, it's difficult to then come back if you don't like medical administration. In your case, there was a clear medical reason for electing to cease your clinical duties.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
often, I see my directors or people that I know who are in medical administration, it's a one-way street. And that's frightening, once we enter medicine because we're not clinical scientists.
I think the answer to that is flexibility. And if you're not happy in the medical administration role, then there may be other opportunities in other things. And you've heard this morning about other opportunities in retirement. But keep your mind active and you keep involved in a medical position. Okay,
I've
great.
seen people do medical administration at a different health service from where they do their clinical work. So they might go 1 day a week to the country and have their major practice and be doing that, say, 2 days a week or something during the week. So they kind of keep the roles a bit separate and they can then pull back from either one if they wanted to.
Good. Any other questions? Okay, well, have fun in your retirement.
Thanks, good. Thank you. Thanks. Did you get a present?
Oh, good, thanks. Thanks very much.
Lovely. Our next speaker is Noel Bayley. Who a lot of people will know Noel from his training time in the city or his time in Warrnambool, and he's got some interesting things to talk about his work as a cardiologist in East Timor.
Thanks, Judy, and thanks for asking me to talk. And I think we should start with a round of applause for Katrina, who I think has got my talk up and running. I was faced with a moment of existential terror there for a while. We had some sort of Mac. I may be speaking too soon. Don't clap her yet. Okay.
Thank you.
How do I advance? Just hit. Cool. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, my background is that. I'm actually in that photograph that Lynda showed you all before, in the class of 77 from Melbourne University. You'd have a bit of trouble recognising me because not only did I have hair then, but it was long and luxuriant. You can see that's no longer the case. I trained at the Royal Melbourne predominantly, spent a year in the UK at the University Hospital of Wales, and then came back to work as a general physician in Warrnambool, where I've been ever since, essentially. And that was in the days when there was only one other physician in the town, so the hours were insane and continued to be like that for a very long time. Nowadays, there are, I think, 12, lost count, we're up to about 12 physicians in Warrnambool, and the increase has allowed people to subspecialise. And for the last 20 plus years, I've basically just done cardiology and respiratory medicine, which were always my first loves. Disclosures. I'm actually not an ASPRO. It was on the invitations, unless someone's promoted me without me knowing about it. I think the loftiest heights I ever reached were a senior lecturer in medicine. And thus far, I'm not retired, and I'm kind of looking towards it with a certain amount of trepidation, although less so at this point in the morning than I was when I walked into the room. So I think it's been a good session. I'll just talk a little bit about East Timor, which is really what's brought me here. The Timorese arrived in East Timor, sorry, the Portuguese arrived in East Timor in about 1500. There was the Dutch arrived at around the same time, and there was a brisk competition. The island was actually covered at that point in sandalwood, which was extraordinarily valuable. There's almost no sandalwood left now, so that tells you what the consequences were environmentally. But the Dutch and the Portuguese competed for the island, and they ended up partitioning it with the Portuguese taking the eastern portion, and the Portuguese were the colonists until 1974, when you might remember there was effectively a revolution in Portland. The then right-wing government was deposed, and the left-wing government wasn't interested in having colonies. And for about 12 months, East Timor was an independent country before it was invaded by the Indonesians. To Australia's eternal shame, we were, I think, the only country that recognised that as a legitimate act. There was then a guerrilla war that went for effectively 25 years, and there were at least 100,000 deaths of Timorese as a consequence. Population's under 1 million, so if you do the math, most people had a family member who was killed during that time. And then in 1991, there was a Santa Cruz cemetery massacre, which some of you may remember. Bishop Bello and Ramos Horta got the Nobel Prize in 96, and in 98, Suharto fell as the ruler of Indonesia. And those three things all together resulted, obviously, in the installation of a new ruler in Jakarta, and he was persuaded to hold an independence referendum for East Timor because of this ongoing guerrilla war, which was basically about seeking independence, and 80% of the population voted in favour of independence. And then all hell broke loose. So while most people in Timor wanted to be independent of Indonesia, there was quite a significant group of people, unfortunately many of them very well armed, trained either policemen or soldiers, and they essentially went on a rampage. So these were private militias, armed and funded and encouraged by the Indonesian military. And in that brief period, there were further tens of thousands of deaths, and the infrastructure, which I'll show you in a second, was destroyed. Australia then redeemed itself to some extent under John Howard's leadership by leading the UN Interfet Force into East Timor and establishing peace. As a consequence of that cascade of events, about 500,000 people, about half the population, were displaced, most of them over the border into or many of them over the border into West Timor. As I said, there was enormous damage to the infrastructure. So the first time I went to Dili, which was the year after independence, the place had been a war zone, and certainly looked at it. So scenes like this, these were residential houses beforehand. That was the Catholic diocesan headquarters. So every large building in Dili was something like that. So enormous loss of life and enormous loss of infrastructure. So the population now is about 1.2 million. It's an incredibly mountainous country. It's very much like Papua New Guinea, and it's possible for people to live 20 kilometres from each other and not be able to ever have any contact just because of geographical barriers. And that's led to the fact that there are at least 20 separate language groups in the country. Mostly Catholic, as you'd expect with Portuguese colonisers, and it's poor. So the GDP per capita is about $1,300 US at the moment. Lots and lots of young people, so 40% of the population is below the age of 16, and about half the population is below the poverty line, which I think at the moment is $2 US a day, and unemployment's rife. Kids everywhere. So the problems of poverty, infrastructure, both physical and human. I'll come back to human if I get time. Natural resources, food security is a real issue because it's so mountainous. There's not a lot of really good arable land. Most people are essentially subsistence farmers and doing it hard. Global warming's not helping at all. Language is an issue. The official language is Portuguese, believe it or not, despite the fact that almost nobody in the Legislative Assembly actually speaks Portuguese. They actually predominantly speak Tetum. A lot of people still speak Bahasa Indonesian as a consequence of the Indonesian occupation. I've talked about the geography, and infectious diseases are a major issue. Malaria and dengue, not so much in recent years in Dili. They were a huge problem when I first started going there 15 years ago. TB is a real problem, and multi-resistant TB is becoming a real problem, and HIV likewise. And from my point of view, what's really got me involved in this is rheumatic heart disease. East Timor's probably got one of the highest rates of rheumatic heart disease in the world. Infrastructure problems. So this is a fairly typical road. This is a major road, believe it or not, out of Dili up into one of the hill towns. You could lose a troop carrier in some of the holes you see there. And you can see that I actually almost went over one of those one night some years ago. It still makes me sweat when I think about it. I had a ute full of timberees in the back of the car. I got involved in 2003. Initially, I was working up in a clinic in the hills above Gleno, which is one of the coffee growing areas, essentially in a GP role. I'm a really terrible GP. I mean, it was awful, but what I discovered was that there was a very large burden of untreated heart disease. So I was seeing kids in 12, 15 with advanced cardiac failure due to untreated rheumatic heart disease. I then went down to Dili, I went to this guy in Dili. This man's called Dan Murphy. I don't think he'd object to me saying he's a grumpy old bastard. He's also probably a secular saint. He's spent his entire life working in the developing world for no remuneration, runs a clinic on a shoestring and works extraordinarily hard. And he showed me a young girl called Maria, who is there actually. She looks reasonably good there. When I saw her, she looked almost dead, grossly edematous. But with what looked like a fairly normal heart clinically. And Dan said, what do you think's wrong with her? And I said, well, I think she's probably got constrictive pericarditis. And he looked a bit surprised and he said, oh, what do you think that's due to? And I said, well, I'm in Timor, so I guess it's TB. And he said, oh, that's what I think too. So I rang Philip Antipa from the Royal Melbourne, who's a good friend of mine, and asked him if he'd be interested in doing a pericardiectomy. And she was my first patient. So we brought her over. She had a pericardiectomy, which was extremely successful. And she's now a healthy young woman with a couple of kids. That kind of got me interested. So then I started to go back regularly doing clinics. The clinics are a mix between a sort of rugby scrum and peak hour and Jakarta. They're incredibly busy. Used to work in a shipping container. I swear you could have fried eggs on the examination couch, which was made out of vinyl. Always take students with me. The teaching is fantastic. Students get to have a listen to the patient's heart. It's commonplace to see 6, 8, 10 patients with classical mitral stenosis on a day, aortic regurgitation, PDAs, VSDs, ASDs, you name it, you see it. So the students get to have a listen, have a quick chat about what we think's going on, and then we do a quick echo to either confirm or not infrequently negate what we thought was going on. The burden of disease. I've talked about rheumatic fever. Pure mitral stenosis is really common, and it's a killer. Interestingly, the distribution is different in males and females. So in young women, you mostly see pure mitral stenosis. If they get pregnant and go into labour, it's a disaster. 500 mils straight from the uterus into the circulation with nowhere for it to go, and they go into flash pulmonary edema, and you lose the mother and the baby in the same transaction. So that's really what I've been focused on predominantly, because it's easy to fix, it's cheap. You do a mitral balloon valvuloplasty, put a balloon up through the right heart across the intra-atrial septum, dilate up the mitral valve. And I mean, the first few of these I organised, done by Rick Harper at Monash for me. I thought, this is probably going to be palliative, but that's not the case at all. I think we've done well over 30 now, and I think we've had 2 who've had to come back for a repeat procedure. So for most of them, it's a sustained fix. Their right heart pressures come down, their left atrial pressures come down, and I've got a bunch of them who've now got 3 and 4 kids who've come through pregnancies entirely safely. It's cheap too. It costs about $5 grand for the balloon, and we often get those donated. More tragically, you see a lot of mixed rheumatic valve disease, severe mitral regurgitation, severe aortic regurgitation, and if you're really unlucky and you get your right heart involved again, and those people do very badly, and we don't have much to offer them for reasons that I'll come to. And we see a lot of untreated congenital disease, ASDs, VSDs, PDAs, etc. I've told you about constrictive pericarditis, and then there's some odds and sods. A couple of myxomas, biggest myxomas I've ever seen, both of whom did extremely well with surgery. There's a bit of coronary artery disease. I didn't see any of that 15 years ago. We're starting to see it now. There isn't actually a McDonald's in Dili, but there are hamburger places, and the equivalent, I think it's being driven by the love of smoking and the changes in diet. Bicuspid aortic valves, Marfan's, WPWs, so all the usual stuff that you see in a cardiology practice in Australia, but very large indeed, with not much coronary disease and lots of valvular disease. Liz Parrott's is one of our cardiologists and one of my ex-registrars, published in the Internal Journal last year. If anybody's interested, look it up. It talks about our 474 consecutive cases from 2003. It is not 2013. So I did this for about 6 or 7 years, basically seeing the patients, picking out the ones I thought would do very well with a single procedure and a single curative procedure. Really didn't get into people who were going to be palliative, and bringing them over and getting them done by basically using a sort of mates network. That meant that the numbers were really small. If I got 3 or 4 cases a year, I was pretty pleased. We then founded a charity called the East Timor Hearts Fund, which has been fundraising, and now we're doing a lot more cases, typically about 12 to 20 a year. And we're also doing a bunch of other stuff, research, penicillin prophylaxis program, in-country surgery, and I hate the term, but capacity building. So now we're visiting 3 times a year. We've got multiple cardiologists involved, doing lots of procedures. Survival rate's extraordinarily good. It's well over 90%, with no deaths in Australia, thank God. And the clinics are now pretty sophisticated. We've got admin people who come with us. A son of a friend of mine built us our own medical record system that's precisely targeted to our needs. We have translators, and as I said, we now have 6 cardiologists, and I'm proud to say that most of them are actually ex-registrars of mine, which I find very touching. This is part of the team from one of our recent trips. Again, what else have we done? We're interested in, obviously, in an ideal world, any decent medical charity aims to do itself out of a job. So, in an ideal world, prevention is what we're after. So one of the things we did was cooperate with some Menzies School of Health in Darwin and a variety of other players to do a prevalence study, and that's how I know precisely what the prevalence of rheumatic heart disease is in East Timor, because we screened 1,400 patients over the course of a week, and that was quite an operation. That's Liz screening one of the schoolgirls. That's the road to one of the places. This is very typical. Okay, you see this stuff everywhere. And you need to be a really good 4-wheel driver to get through that stuff. I wouldn't even attempt it. And that's the screening team. So you can see it was a major operation. And there we are in the bar at the end of the episode, going through the echoes, beer in hand. We're also running a penicillin prophylaxis program. So what have I learned from doing all this? Well, firstly, I've discovered it's possible to see 60 patients in a day if you really have to. It's hard, and needless to say, the sort of cardiology you practice is utterly different to what you do here. I discovered also that I can do a basic echo in a couple of minutes and get the information I really need to know whether a patient is suitable for intervention or not. I've now developed a very large and long experience of the management of rheumatic heart disease. And I've learnt that remarkable things grow from serendipity, essentially. I didn't set out to do this at all. It just kind of one thing led to another, which led to another. And it's turned, the charity is now turned into something of consequence. Certainly learned lots of humility, as always when you practice medicine, you're wrong at regular intervals. And especially, and the other thing is, what's really humbling is, quite frequently I have to have conversations with parents and patients saying, you've got 3 clapped out valves, we can't do anything for you. And these will often be 14-year-olds or 16-year-olds, and you're talking to the patient and their family. And without exception, they, how can I put this? They take that news with grace, which is probably more than I could do. And also respect for the same reasons, although also mingled with frustration. Timor is a really difficult place to work in terms of infrastructure and in terms of the having systems at work. And finally, gratitude for the patients and for all of my colleagues and friends who've been involved. So how does this apply to? So that's my experience of working overseas as a volunteer. So how does it apply to retiring physicians? Well, I think the first thing is get into it before you retire, for a couple of reasons. I think, firstly, while you're still working, you've got a lot of contacts and you've got influence and you've even got some power to get stuff done that is likely to disappear pretty quickly. I mean, I think you'd make the transition from a rooster to a feather duster fairly fast once. So try and start doing stuff while you've still got some clout. And I think also there's a little bit of a risk that if you kind of retire and then say, I think I'd like to go and work, do this or that overseas, there's a sort of slight taint of medical tourism to that in my view, and I think that's highly undesirable. So I think get into it as soon as you can. And probably the most important thing I can say, and I think here I'm echoing the other speakers, is don't see yourself just as a doctor, because we're all a lot more than that. We all have administrative skills. We probably all have pretty solid computer skills. I mean, we're probably like you. I started doing computing, doing sort of punching holes in bits of paper in secondary school when the only computer in Victoria was out at Monash, and I think it was using Fortran. But by now, I suspect probably everybody in this room can find their way around a spreadsheet and around a medical records program and so on. So you may, you may have something to offer as a clinician, but you've almost certainly got stuff to offer in other fields. So admin, acting as an advocate for organisations, getting involved in fundraising. I think the sky's the limit. So have a realistic look at what you can do, and then have a look around and say, well, where would I like to apply these skills? It doesn't have to be overseas, of course, but there is certainly plenty of opportunity overseas so to do. And to finish, there is an organisation called the Australian Volunteers International. They're actually domiciled in Fitzroy, and it's funded by DFAT, and basically their brief is to support Australians volunteering overseas. I had a chat to them the other day when I knew I was going to give this talk. They're very interested to hear from people like us. As I said before, got lots of skills. They're not really going to send people over to work as doctors. There are a lot of problems with that. The only reason we've been able to do it in Timor to the extent we have is because the Timorese system is so primitive they don't actually have a medical registration system at the moment. You can just wander into town with a stethoscope around your neck and say, where's the first patient? And nobody raises an eyebrow. But I don't think there are too many places in the world you can do that. So you wouldn't be going over to work as directly as in patient care with them, but they're very interested in people who've got teaching skills, admin skills, setting up systems, and so on. So I think if you're interested in this sort of stuff, they're well worth talking to. And they actually provide stuff like airfare. They don't provide a salary, but they provide airfares and per diem living expenses and the like. And with that, I'll close, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Noel? Sorry, Ed?
Apart from the computer almost not working, my hearing aid died this morning and the backup battery was a dud. So I actually thought I was quite likely to get struck by lightning standing up here just to complete the trifecta, so I'll come down to you.
I can borrow mine to ask. How many patients a year would you send to Australia for intervention?
How many have we done this far?
Well, how many per annum?
Oh, okay.
How many units?
Cumulatively now we're up, I think, to about 130, and How many we do in a year, it depends on how much money we've got. Initially, or as I said, all the paid cases were done pro bono. As I said, Rick Harper at Monash was a huge supporter, did lots of mindful allowance for us. Royal Melbourne have been incredibly supportive. More recently, Geelong Hospital have been very supportive. But once we sort of established the charity and actually had some money, we basically pay a mate's rates price per case. So typically about 10,000 for a mindful balloon and about 20 for open heart surgery. And the direct answer to the question is somewhere between 12 and 20 a year, depending on how big that pocket is in that particular year. Something to do with that.
Okay, Andrew?
I went there with the United Nations Military Medical Service in 2000 and 2001. And it's just staggering. I walked through the TB ward and saw more cases of TB than I've ever seen before since being in Parkin. But the other thing that's really impressive how much the destruction was. And we realised how important something really fundamental and basic is, like water supply, sewerage and silage, and education and engineers. I went to the market where they were slaughtering the cattle at 3 o'clock in the morning so that they could sell the meat by 6, because then it was going to be cooked, because they had no reliable electricity and no refrigerators. It's just amazing what an education are and how lucky we are in a country like this.
Thank you.
I didn't catch any of that.
His experience.
Right, okay. Sorry, can't help you.
That's all right. Any other questions for Noel?
Only from people who can shout.
Okay, good. No, thank you. Our final speaker is a fellow of the College of Surgeons, Brian Collopy, who is going to talk about a very interesting subject and about the book that he's written as a result. Thanks.
Lawyers in the room. Good. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, Judy, to what has been to me a very enjoyable morning. I'm going to talk about a book I've written concerning this very controversial surgeon, James Beanie, and half of the book covers one of the court cases that he endured. There were at least 6 that he was involved in, but this is just one of them in the latter half of the 19th century. My daughter, an artist, did the cover, and she initially had him dancing on a coffin. He's got a big bladder stone in one hand and champagne in the other. But I suggested to her that unlike lawyers, there are things that a surgeon wouldn't do. Now, why did I start on this? Well, I knew there were Beanie prizes. I didn't win one, but the top students in Melbourne could win in surgery and pathology this special prize. And I was looking through the history of infection in Victorian hospitals, and I came across this government committee report about infection in Melbourne, in the Melbourne hospital. It had been chaired by Beanie, who by then was in Parliament, and it was a whitewash, and I'll refer to it later. The second thing was a small monograph had been given to me by a GP friend who found in his father's possessions this short story of an inquest that concerned Beanie. So I thought, well, I'll have to find more about it. So my aims were to describe this controversial surgeon and how he did so well in that period of marvellous Melbourne, to talk about the limitations of hospital care in that period, and then to illustrate the brilliance of the barrister James Purvis, who defended him in this particular case. Now, to access 19th century information, it was pre-Google, so I spent a lot of time in the in Swanson Street in the library, looking at the old papers, particularly the Age and the Argus, going through old medical journals in the AMA library, reading novels about Melbourne, and then I came across this very valuable Australian dictionary of biography, of which there have been about 6 volumes. It had a long gestation period. I actually commenced in the 90s and put it aside and started again on it about 2015, and it was finally published last year. Now, I'll break the Parkin rule here in that I'll let you read some of this and I'll talk about other little parts of the slide. You'll see that this is a monument in the Melbourne General Cemetery which towers over everything else around it, and it's been his monument. He had a lot of qualifications, as you see. What is wrong there is his age. He was probably 63 because, as far as we can determine, he was born in 1828. He was born in Canterbury, Kent, into a working class family. The father died early and mother raised the 3 children. He was industrious as a young man, and he worked hard in a chemist shop, then was an errand boy to a GP, and then apprenticed to a surgeon. He was encouraged by that surgeon to study medicine, but he became ill, and I think that TB then was like East Timor now, perhaps. 40% of the poorer families had one or more members with TB, and probably that's what Beanie had. He was encouraged to take a long sea voyage, which he did, and ended up in Melbourne via America. He worked in a pharmacy, just cleaning bottles, etc., and went back to the UK in 1855 and obtained the diploma in surgery from the Edinburgh University. He came back to Melbourne in 1858, and he was very fortunate in obtaining this locum to a Dr. Maund in Collins Street, because Maund died within a year and Beanie took over his practice. I beg your pardon? Any suspicious circumstances? We don't think so. Now, physically he was short and podgy, and some said he had these shifty blue eyes. And his hair rose up on each side, and the papers said that they resembled a pair of horns. But he was always very neatly attired by the city's finest tailors, which at that time were the George brothers. And George's building is still there in Collins Street, and probably your mother's shop there. Now, in 1860, he obtained the fellowship from the Edinburgh College of Surgeons and was immediately appointed to the Melbourne Hospital as an honorary surgeon. He developed a very highly successful private practice, and that salary of £14,000 is well up there with the CEOs of our 4 pillars, the banks, and previous chief executives of Australia Post. In other words, several millions of dollars. Now, when he was appointed in 1860, the gold was just beginning to come to Melbourne, which had a population of around 250,000. There were very few surgeons in Melbourne at that time, so that's possibly why he started to do well. They'd all come from the British Isles, and more would come in the next decade or 2. Now, 20 years on, with all the gold, Melbourne was then one of the richest cities in the world, and it was the marvellous Melbourne period. And many of the doctors who'd come to Ballarat and Bendigo gave up and came back to practice in Melbourne. But they found their surgical morbidity was very high, and almost all of them faced litigation at some time, and either spent time in court defending themselves or accusing others or defending their friends. It was very busy in the courts. He wore a lot of bling. He had a gold watch and chain, and he wore diamond and ruby rings on his fingers. He was said to walk around with approximately £10,000 worth of jewellery on his person. And when he was operating, he wore a none too clean white coat, over a colourful vest, still with a watch and chain on, and rings on his fingers. And this was before gloves came in. Gloves didn't come in until the 1890s. So you can imagine infection issues. He was and boasted about his constant liking and consumption of alcohol. And he also prescribed it to his patients in the hospital. There weren't many other drugs then. The clever physicians hadn't come along. You had digitalis perhaps, and that's about all. And he did run up the hospital bills, as the secretary noted. He was characterised in the press as Champagne Jimmy. Now, in 1864, although he was acquitted in a second trial concerning the death of a barmaid from a ruptured uterus, the scandal was very significant and he lost his Melbourne hospital appointment, being replaced by Edward Barker, whose name I'll come back to. However, despite losing the hospital appointment, his practice flourished and he engaged William Solway to design him this 4-storey mansion, which he called Cromwell House. And it stands today without its tower as the House of Louis Vuitton. Now, some of your mothers wouldn't have gone there, but maybe some of the women here have gone there. Now, it's said that he wrote about 20 textbooks on surgery and on venereal diseases, but he wasn't the author of them all. He was re-elected to the Melbourne Hospital in 1875. Election was by members of the public and subscribers to the hospital, and he advertised widely, spending several thousands of pounds in doing so. And he displaced Edward Barker, who had replaced him earlier. Now, in that same year of his reappointment, in the same month but not on the same day, he had these 2 problem cases. A boy of 15 with a painful, deformed hip, and Beanie performed what we'd call today a Girdleston operation. For the physicians here, that is removing the head of the femur and expecting that the muscles around the hip joint will allow the patient to walk. But the boy died under chloroform anaesthesia, and there'd been about 11 deaths that year under chloroform. The second case, more of a cause célèbre, was a man from the country with a huge bladder stone. And Beanie, before a sizable audience, he used to invite people to the operating theatre, ply them with champagne and let them watch him operate. He had the patient in the lithotomy position, and he incised through the perineum, going through the prostate into the bladder, and at the same time cutting the anterior wall of the rectum. So it was a sizable wound. He got the stone out intact. It rolled to the floor and was picked up, but the patient died of sepsis several days later. Unwisely, he had a cast of the stone made and placed with another in the window of Bellaire's Collins Street bookshop, where his texts were on show, and he had a little acknowledgement there as to who'd removed them. Now, in the Argus, who remembers the Argus? It was really the morning paper, and on Friday the 17th of December there was an editorial about the Barry inquest. That's the boy with the hip. Quite critical of Beanie. Beanie was furious and immediately wrote a letter, had it delivered to the editor that Friday afternoon. It was published the next morning. You wouldn't get that now, by the way. Beanie's letter said the operation he did on the boy Barry was his own. On the Monday, there was a letter highly critical of Beanie, signed a practical surgeon. And in this letter, this surgeon claimed the Barry operation was not original, that's the one for the hip, and that Beanie had performed the wrong operation on birth, that's the patient with the stone, resulting in the patient's death from peritonitis. Now, this letter was read by the Minister for Justice, and he said there must be a police inquiry. When the resident doctors were interviewed, not in the presence of their seniors, they spoke of great force being used, and the operation went for an unusually long time. Now, when the coroner, Dr. Ewell, received that report, he said there has to be a post-mortem and there will be an inquest. The post-mortem was held on Christmas Day, 1875, and the only doctors Ewell could get to perform it were 2 university lecturers. What that says about university lecturers, I'm not sure. But Edward Barker, the surgeon that he had displaced, and Dr. Neal, a physician who was not very well up with his practice. Now, the coroner was to act as both judge and prosecutor. And because Beanie was facing murder or manslaughter, he was allowed legal representation. Now, it was holiday time, and Beanie's solicitor could only engage a young barrister called James Purvis, who was known to have a rather aggressive manner which could upset the colony's judges. The inquest commenced on the following Wednesday at the morgue, which was then down near the Yarra because most bodies turned up in the Yarra. And incidentally, Melbourne was the second city in the world to have a morgue after Paris, well before London and New York, possibly because Melbourne was then still a Wild West town with all the gold coming in. Anyway, the first witnesses were Doctors Neal and Barker, and Purvis in cross-examination revealed Neal to be quite incompetent and Barker to be biased against Beanie. Purvis also extracted evidence that or from Neal that there was no evidence of peritonitis at the post-mortem. The practical surgeon had said the patient died with peritonitis. Purvis revealed that prior to this operation to the stone, Beanie had gone to what they then called the dead house at the hospital and practiced the incision on 2 bodies to determine access. Purvis also, from current textbooks, demonstrated the complexities of this operation and its complications, and said Birth had died from surgical kidney described as a flare-up of pre-existing kidney inflammation. Now, that's in 1875 and not far from the truth, probably. The inquest went over 2 days. The jury couldn't determine the cause of death, as the doctors had argued over it, but 12 of them agreed there's no evidence to say Beanie was negligent, but he had broken a hospital rule. And there was Rule 7, which required that prior to any major elective surgery, a consultation with all the other surgeons had to be held. As the coroner required only the opinion of 12, all men of course then, he terminated proceedings. The newspapers were very favourable to Beanie and considered that his rivals, those other surgeons, had plotted against him. But an editorial in what was then called the Australian Medical Journal, not the MJA, it was critical of Beanie and scathing of Purvis, describing him as ill-tempered and callous. Birth probably died because of septicemia and renal failure. He did have long-standing kidney and bladder disease, and most importantly, he'd had these urethral sounds passed several days beforehand. So the operation, he died about a week after the sounds were passed, and that could fit in with a gram-negative septicemia. His death probably was inevitable. The mortality rate in our hospitals in those days was 20%. This is the stone display, which the practical surgeon noted and then wrote his letter. The identity of the practical surgeon was never disclosed, but it probably was Edward Barker. Was Beanie a good surgeon? Probably as competent as most, but not as skilled as Thomas Fitzgerald, the then outstanding Melbourne surgeon. But the hip operation on the boy Barry could have been an original because Girdleston didn't describe it until 1943. Beanie died in 1891 from a cerebral condition complicating liver disease and gout, appearing to confirm his overindulgence in alcohol. He had boasted that he had a claret for morning breakfast, fizz, as he called champagne, at lunch, and more fizz or perhaps some more claret for the evening meal. His wife had predeceased him. Sadly, they had no children, but his estate was estimated at around £60,000, in today's value, several hundred millions of dollars. He provided money for repairs to the Canterbury Cathedral, and there's a plaque in the cathedral, and there's his bust. He made bequests to Guy's and Thomas's hospitals and left £30,000 for the then existing 8 Melbourne hospitals. I mentioned the Beanie Prizes he originally had established. They exist today at scholarships at the registrar level at the Melbourne University Associated Teaching Hospitals. Anyone here on one? No. Oh! Oh, excellent. What's your name? There we go. I dips my lid. He left £10,000 to establish in Canterbury this Institute for the Education of the Working Man. It exists today, and the Canterbury Council has just spent £14 million in renovating the building, and it's now affectionately known as the Beanie. It's a museum, a library, and an art gallery. Now, the negative side, I mentioned this earlier on. He'd been elected to the upper house in 1883, and in 1886 he chaired this government committee investigating the high infection rate in the Melbourne hospital. Now, as the papers reported this committee's findings, it was an absolute whitewash because he and his colleagues didn't want that hospital moved from Lonsdale Street, they were practicing in Collins Street, didn't want to have to go up to Parkville near the university. So the infection rate in that hospital continued, and the hospital's move was delayed for over 50 years. He was a very social person, loved being entertained and entertaining. He was a member of many clubs, as you see here. But he was also a member of the Medical Society of Victoria until he posed on a trip overseas with a forged letter from the then Premier of Victoria as an ambassador for the state. What type of man was our James Beanie? He was described by the historian Dr. Craig as egregious, and by Dr. Murray Morton, a surgeon nearer to his time, as a charlatan. But I think they're a bit unfair. I think he was probably opportunistic rather than unscrupulous. He was, however, quite inconsistent in behaviour, practising on cadavers before an operation, but sometimes neglecting to see patients when the resident staff called. And he was a generous philanthropist, but limited in providing for his surviving sister and brother. So I think it's reasonable to say he was a controversial surgeon. While he sits with the angels in his birthplace in Canterbury, in his adopted city of Melbourne, the majority of his colleagues at that time would have considered that Beanie supped with the devil. Now, a few of the other players very quickly. Judy, I know we're over time, but Purvis went on to be one of Australia's top barristers, and his mansion still stands in Clarendon Street, East Melbourne. It's being converted to luxury units at the moment. Poor Edward Barker, who was on the hospital, off the hospital, was probably a better surgeon than Beanie and a more conventional person. Unfortunately, he was involved in much litigation and died in impecunious circumstances. But his name lives on in Melbourne forever, and I didn't know this till I began looking about him, that Barker's Road in Kew is named after Edward Barker. Well, the surgeon at the time, Sir Thomas Fitzgerald, He was the first medical knight in this country. He was quite a sportsman. He owned a lot of racehorses, and he bought Lefebvre's painting of Chloe. Poor Chloe, she was aged 19. Her name was Marie, and she came from what was then called Persia. Unfortunately, it is said that she died at her own hand 2 years after because of her unrequited love for the artist Lefebvre. Now, back to the subject of a book. And those of you who feel you have one in you, waiting for it to come out, all it requires is time and effort. When this young author died, because of her youth, she was allowed to see both heaven and hell. She went down to have a look at hell first, and there she saw row upon row of authors chained to their desks and sweating as they tapped away on their laptops and were periodically whipped by an overseer. Oh goodness, she said, can I now see heaven? So she was whisked up to heaven, and to her disappointment, there she saw row upon row of authors chained to their desks, sweating as they tapped away on their laptops and being periodically whipped by an overseer. Oh God, she said, this is just like hell. But a voice came over, no, up here, their work is published. Now, my publisher said, don't go without advertising. Thank you for listening.
So, any questions on writing a book? Can I just ask, are you part of the medical history group?
No, I'm not. I should be, but
Okay. Do you want to just tell people a little bit about that? There is a group in Melbourne called the Medical History Group.
The Medical History Society, I am a member of, but I have actually not attended much of their doing. But they're part of the an Australia-wide history association, and they had a conference here in Melbourne a couple of years ago, which was for my first introduction to them, and fascinating.
They have regular meetings.
They do have regular meetings, and they do have fascinating sounding talks, which I've yet to get to, but which I plan to.
I think there's a whole depth to the city that we don't consider in the history of the places where we work, etc. Such as Beanie. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I think that everyone in them would have some humour, and I'm going to talk to surgeons in a few weeks about putting out some humour that's come from surgery. So could probably be done with the physicians.
Just as a preface, I'm actually a member of the Medical History Society and can thoroughly recommend it. You mentioned casually, my publisher said this and this, but did you have trouble getting a publisher to? I mean, it seems to be the story that people have to go to many, many publishers to finally get accepted, or was it so good that you only had to go to one?
No. Part of putting it aside, I went to MUP first, Melbourne University Press, and I waited 3 months. I noticed it said there'll be a long gap between replying. When they replied, they said, "I'm sorry, we've rejected it, and we're too busy to say why." so that was enough for me at that stage, and I just put it aside for a long time. And I was a bit cunning because my daughter, whom I said did the illustration, had done illustrations for this particular publisher. So I was on his side for a start. But that is a problem, no doubt about it, getting your book published, particularly if there's something old like that. Who's going to read that, you know? So it's got to have some stimulus for them to read.
I have a friend who's published a book, which is a little bit different from all the books that we're talking about, because her mother was going into a nursing home, and my friend, who is an ophthalmologist, wanted to write a history of the house that her mother had lived in. It's not an exotic history, it's about when the family had moved in there, getting it built, different birthday parties, what the garden had looked at. It had lots of photographs in it too. And my friend and colleague self-published that book, but she made a number of copies, and she said altogether it cost about $2,500. So it was quite, and it's quite, it looks like a book, but it was, when I saw it in her a bag that she carries all of her instruments around in it, I knew that it was this book that she had written for her mother in particular. So it's not impossible, it just depends whether you want your book on sale at readings. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So that concludes our session for today. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for staying till the end, and we hope we'll have some more activities also that are related to all of the colleges getting together. So perhaps later in the year. Last year we did have a meeting on how our health system works, which involved the different people, Department of Health, CEO of the Royal Melbourne Hospital, etc., talking about what their roles involved too, and also a Chief Financial Officer talking about the budget cycle and how to get funding for something within your health service. So hopefully we'll have some more activities too. Thank you once again.
Thanks very much.